Quick announcement. I'm Amir. I help run Bernardo Kastrup's weekly Q&A program with realityinmind.com. And this month, August 2025, we are taking questions about anomalous phenomena ranging from psychic experiences to UAP sightings. If you'd like to join the Q&As, you can find us at withrealityinmind.com. You also get access to over 50 hours now of recordings on topics ranging from science to psychology, from Buddhism to biology. And if for some reason you can't afford the regular membership, please write to us with a short note on your motivations and your circumstances, and we'll do our best to accommodate. So far, no one has been turned away for lack of funds. I posted a short clip, an excerpt from a few weeks ago, where you were saying how the same statistical pattern that shows up at CERN in physics might win a Nobel Prize, but equally the same pattern that shows up in a psi phenomena or psychic studies will be discarded as random because random can accommodate any pattern if you've already decided a priori that it must be random. Um, that was really useful. And then uh, basically, someone, it would just clarify, I think, for everyone, and maybe I'll release this your answer in a short follow-up, because there was a few comments in the chat where people were saying something along the lines of the ability to repeat the experiment is the key. At CERN, the bump will always show up in the same conditions all the time, otherwise it's noise, but in psi studies, that's not true. Or someone else was saying, but CERN would have to be anyone that can repeat the experiment at any time. Do you someone else came back with, well, all of psychology has a replicability crisis anyway,
Prizes.
but I wonder if you have other comments in response to that.
It is true that a result is much more reliable if it is consistent with the experimental conditions. So if you set up the experiment in the same way and you do the same things, you get the same statistical fluctuations. That's much more reliable if you see a fluctuation that is orders of magnitude uh, uh, um, deviated from what you would expect from chance alone, but it cannot be repeated. So the comment is true. And the thing is that I have seen studies, for instance, of precognition, and it's not precognition in the way we normally refer to it. It's the emotional response of a subject to a picture that hasn't been shown to the subject yet. You get a statistically significant effect under repeatable conditions. So you can get that under repeatable conditions, and people still dismiss it, which I think, well, okay, that's not consistent then. And the second part of the answer is that there are things in science that are considered totally scientific and cannot be repeated. That's observational science. For instance, the whole of astronomy is an observational science. You cannot set up the conditions to have a supernova explode. You cannot set up the conditions to form a black hole and then repeat it and form another black hole and repeat it and form another black hole. You can't do that in the lab. So does anybody question astronomy as a science? No, nobody questions. People understand that it's an observational science, and we can still derive conclusions on the basis of statistics, even though we are not repeating experiments here. We are not even making experiments. We are just observing nature. So the fact that in some of these cases, for instance, the study done at Princeton many years ago with random number generators and the correlation of random number generators deviating from mean, the correlation of that with world events that sort of have a lot of emotional evocative power. That thing had, it was well beyond 3 sigma. I think it was beyond even 6 sigma. In other words, it was statistically a very strong observation. Could you repeat it? No, you can't go and do 9/11 again to see if the numbers will deviate the same way. Does it make it less scientific because it's purely observational? Well, if it does, then you have to say astronomy is not a science.
What are your favorite experiments that studied psi phenomena in a lab setting? So obviously this comment and others it makes it sound like there have been others that maybe have impressed you or feel like they should have been taken more seriously than they have. Are there any
Um,
others you can point us to that we can look at?
yeah, I'm not really hot on sci stuff. I
Okay.
know it's the theme for today, um, but it's not something that really. I'm curious about UAPs, even though I gave up on that because it's too much crap happening around it. It's too much effort to sort wheat from chaff, so I gave up on it. But other than UAPs, and that's because of my own personal experience when I was a kid, that's why I'm interested in that. Um, but sci in general, I'm not going to say that it's boring, but I don't know. It never had a hold on me. It's like I don't need any experiment to convince me that telepathy happens. I've seen it happen, not to me, but I've seen it happen enough that to me it's a done deal. It happens, and I find it entirely natural. It's not like, whoa, fantastic. Well, why? Why shouldn't it happen? I know the way I see the world under the umbrella of analytic idealism renders all of this stuff to me very natural. And the side effect of that is that I don't feel excited about it. So I can't answer the question of which psi experiment is my favorite because I don't know which one. I have seen some of this stuff, but I never zeroed in on it enough that I have favorites and champions. And I can't even talk very fluently about the experimental part of it because I haven't really followed it much. I've seen enough that it tells me that yeah, there are people out there who are doing proper science and they are getting proper results that are statistically significant according to the guidelines of any science, even if it's observational. Um, so I don't have a very favorite, but let me add one thing that may or may not have anything to do with your question, but at least has to do with the previous question. I wanted to add it. Um, a, a criticism we often hear um, about people who study this phenomena is that even though the effects are statistically significant and therefore they count, they are still very small effects. I wanted to comment on that. People in science make careers on very small effects. And a lot of that is indeed bullshit because the threshold for statistical significance is entirely arbitrary. Someone in the 1930s said, yeah, P 0.5 should be 0.5 should be it. And then we thought, yeah, good idea, and we stick to it. So if it's more than that, it's statistically significant. If it's less than that, it's not. It's arbitrary, but people have made careers on this arbitrary thresholds. So the criticism, the effect is statistically significant but is small, may be valid, but if it is valid, we have to apply it to the rest of science as well. And I wonder who is prepared to do that because many careers will come to an end. The other thing I wanted to say about it is we are very naive in our understanding of these psi effects because we want to believe that they are equivalent to dropping a ball or shooting an electron onto a calorimeter. In other words, this stuff that happens in the laboratory, we want to think that psi is the same thing. In other words, something detached, autonomic, that if the right conditions are met, it happens. And we can set up all of those right conditions objectively and impartially and dispassionately. That is naive because we have every reason to believe that for a psi effect to be strong, you need real world circumstances and the emotional engagement that goes with the real world substances. If you see a car about to run over your child, that will evoke more stuff than if you are inside the laboratory being instructed to press a button when you have a feeling of this or that. I mean, shouldn't this be obvious, right? It's obvious that to constellate mental phenomena that are clearly connected with emotional charge, that emotional charge has to be part of the conditions that have to be put in place to trigger the effect. But we hardly do that. This experiment I mentioned earlier, that people start having an emotional reaction to a photo before they actually see the photo, that was done correctly because they used terrible photos of people dismembered, and photos that really have an emotional impact on people. Um, but a lot of these other experiments, even the investigators try to do it in a sort of a clinical, ascetic, dispassionate, impartial way, like we do the rest of science. Well, in this case, this is the wrong way to do science, because it means you are neglecting to put in place the necessary conditions to trigger the effect you want to account for or verify. And to put those conditions in place, you have to evoke an emotional state in people. And that's hardly done. And I would say, until that is done, the criticism that the effect is there but is small, to me, falls in deaf ears. Because I'm like, of course it's small. You're doing it with a lab coat in an ascetic clinical laboratory setting with no emotional evocation, which has very little to do with the realities of the real world when these things happen spontaneously. How can you hope to trigger it with any significant level of strength when the conditions that trigger it are precisely the conditions you make sure are not there? So yeah, that to me is not a valid criticism.
Ron, you put a really interesting comment that I think is worth saying, just so it's in the recording.
First of all, nice to speak with you both again, Bernardo. Great,
Hi, Ron. Good
great
to
to
see
speak
you.
to you. With every answer you give to every question, it's a tremendous help, so I appreciate it. In the land of woo, which I often work in, but try to reduce the amount of its prevalence, that is one of the arguments which you mentioned with astronomy, is that they don't give it any credibility as a field thing. There was a gentleman in Italy named Marcello Bacci who did voice phenomena through white noise on an old vacuum tube radio, and he had an Italian group called Il Laboratorio who did, in fact, bring him into a lab, RF shielded, dissected his radio. He still got anomalous voices. It seemed the only thing that would cease the voices was removing Marcello. So that
Uh-huh.
he did have a 3-year instance when this Italian team, Il Laboratorio, did dissect his entire vocal phenomenon process from start to finish. Um,
Could you
but
say
that
in
is the one.
a couple
Sure.
of sentences for people who don't know what it is, what
Oh,
anomalous?
sure. So EVP, or what's called electronic voice phenomenon. There was a gentleman named Marcello Bacci in Grosseto, Italy, and he did it for a very altruistic purpose. He didn't charge people a dime. They would allegedly have loved ones, mostly children who died prematurely, come through. It was a very benevolent act, what he did with this ability. So there was no charlatan aspect or money-making part of it, or fame seeking at all. And he would use a vacant, no radio emission white noise channel on a vacuum tube radio, which is, pre-transistor. And he would have anomalous voices that would come through in real time and respond to him, or they would respond to sitters who were in the room at a given session. Um, he was taken into RF shielded laboratories. They took the vacuum tubes out of his radio. One of the scientists said, "There's 3 vacuum tubes in your radio. I'm going to take one out. If you still get voices, I'm taking 2 out. If you still get voices, I'll take all 3 out. And if it happens, then I'll eat the tube." And they did it. And after all 3 tubes came out, there were still anomalous voices coming through the white noise. And then Marcello told the scientist, he goes, "No, no, no, don't eat tube. It's glass." So it's interesting. Some people feel that a lot of the phenomena like that, or just in general, what's considered quote unquote paranormal phenomena, may have an integral aspect to the experience that is rooted in the location, which through idealism I found even to be more perhaps supported if the location is fundamentally mental but represented to our walls of perception as physical, and then something emotional happened, or something mental that happened, and then someone else's mentation who is present at the place now picks up on such thing. An experience happens with the experiencer, that all could be more entangled or make more sense intermingling because you have mental or emotional stuff mixing with mental and emotional stuff. So I guess to my long way around from what Amir brought me in on, some folks feel that the location itself versus taking it into a sterile laboratory for repeatability purposes may be taking the yeast out of the bread.
Of course. Look, under analytic idealism, the closest physical representation to mind at large, to core subjectivity, the closest physical representation of that, the closest thing we can imagine to visualize what mind at large is, what core subjectivity is empty space, which we know is full of potential. Quantum fluctuations arise in completely empty space, vacuum. So the best imagination, the best visual representation for universal consciousness is empty space. A location in space is a physical representation of a cognitive neighborhood. So if you're having, say, a complex thought with several steps, I am the son of my mother and I was born because my mother met my father on that date at that place and they loved each other because my mother's like this and my father's like that. Now, it's a whole storyline with lots of cognitive associations, lots of cognitive stuff coming together. A cognitive neighborhood is a point in this chain that I just described as an example. So like a cognitive neighborhood is the meeting of my mother and my father. Another neighborhood is my mother's personality. Another neighborhood is my coming out of that meeting of my mother and my father. So in this entire story, there are distinct cognitive neighborhoods. The places in the story, the junctions in the story arch. Where are you in that story arch? These are cognitive neighborhoods. Locations in space are the best representation of cognitive neighborhoods. So we evolved to put our attention and focus on cognitive neighborhoods that have a direct bearing on the maintenance of our dissociation. In other words, a direct bearing on our survival. The representation of that physically is the here, because it's the stuff that is here that has a direct bearing on my survival. What's happening in China right now probably isn't going to kill me, but what's happening in this room might. You see? So locations in space are dashboard representations of cognitive neighborhoods. Where are you in your cognitive subjective inner space, right? Now, I'm going to say something now that will look like in the beginning that it has nothing to do with your question. Bear with me. At the end, I will somehow bring it back to your question. When we, in science, when we value doing an experiment in laboratory settings, the reason we value that is that within laboratory settings, we can control the conditions that influence the experiential outcome, the experimental outcome. In other words, we can ensure that the experimental results will not be biased by things we don't know are going on. So if you're doing an electromagnetic experiment, you want to do it within a Faraday cage, otherwise your result may change when the train goes across the rails 5 kilometers away. Or when your neighbor turns on his ham radio. So you don't want that, because if this stuff influences your results, you don't know what you're seeing. You don't know what influences were there. So we want to isolate the experiment under controlled laboratory conditions so we can catalog everything that may be playing a role in the results. That's the only way to arrive at reliable conclusions from any experiment. Otherwise, you're just dealing with noise. You don't know what and why is happening. You can't arrive at any conclusion. But the moment we do that, and we do that for very good reasons, as I hope to have convinced you of, isolating experimental setups under laboratory conditions is done with very good reason. But the moment we do that, we pay a price, and we don't know we are paying that price because of our unexamined philosophical prejudices. The assumption we are making when we isolate an experiment under laboratory conditions is that all causal influences are microscopic. In other words, everything that can have a bearing in an experiment done within the confines of a laboratory, everything that has a bearing on the possible results of that experiment are themselves inside the laboratory, are microscopic. In other words, by confining the experiment to the walls of a laboratory, you are not automatically disqualifying certain experimental outcomes, because you assume that whatever affects the experiment are microscopic local influences. This may sound entirely obvious because of our philosophical prejudices. We think causation goes from the microscopic to the macroscopic via these little interactions of little elementary particles bumping around each other. Actually, they never bump on each other, but never mind. That's how we visualize what's going on. So we are not excluding anything out by accident the moment we confine the experiment within the walls of a laboratory, because this stuff comes from the microscopic to the macroscopic anyway, right? So we are not, by construction, biasing the experiment, because whatever influences there could be that are outside the laboratory, they too are microscopic influences. So they could only be noise. They could only be unwelcome. Now, this will become clear if I give you the counterexample. So our prejudice is that all causal influences are microscopic. In other words, all influences are local and happen at close proximity. So if you're looking for a psi effect, to go back to your question finally, if you're looking for a psi effect, the assumption is anything that can possibly have a bearing on producing that side effect can happen within the confines of the laboratory. Because if you don't make that assumption, the moment you isolate it in the laboratory, you are already putting an enormous bias on the experiment. You may already be excluding the causal forces that would lead to the very phenomena you're looking for. The alternative is that that's not how the world works. The world may be non-local. It is entirely coherent to think that to constellate a certain effect that you're looking for, you need a set of circumstances that span a city, at least a neighborhood, maybe a country, maybe the entire cosmos. But because we have this prejudice that all causal influences are local and microscopic, we are not aware that this may not be the case. You know, to speak the language of mathematics, if you know what cellular automata are, we think that the physical world is like a gigantic local cellular automaton in which all causal influences can only be exerted by cells in the neighborhood of the cell you're looking for. But maybe the neighborhood of your cellular automata rule is much larger. Maybe things that are hundreds of meters away, maybe they are inherent to the causal processes that lead to the effect you're trying to look for. And the moment you confine stuff in a laboratory, you are structurally excluding the possibility that the phenomenon will manifest. And we don't know that, again, and I'm repeating this because it's so counterintuitive. So by repeating, I'm trying to sort of open your inner eyes to it. We assume that all causation is microscopic and local. So the confines of a laboratory are enormous. They should be sufficient to capture everything that plays a role in causing the stuff you're looking for. But that's an entirely arbitrary assumption. There is plenty of empirical reason, even physically, to think that stuff can happen non-locally. I'll give you a concrete example. Recent research a few years ago in Israel has shown that the seemingly random mutations that lead to evolution may not be random at all. And in fact, they found a case which was not random. It turned out that genes in the part of your genome that has to do with immune responsive to a malaria infection, mutations in those genes happen much more frequently in places where malaria occurs than in places where there is no malaria. In places where malaria never occurs, random mutations in the genes of that specific part of your genome, immune response to malaria, they hardly happen. In places where malaria does occur, those mutations occur more frequently. Now, can you account for this with local causation? Of course not. Clearly, whatever is happening there is taking into account a much broader neighborhood in your cellular automata rule, broad enough that it knows whether malaria is happening within that neighborhood or not. This is not going to be a lab. It's not going to be a house. It's not going to be a village, right? So if we are to be truly scientific about investigating psi phenomena, we cannot make these assumptions that if these phenomena do not happen within the confines of a laboratory, then they never happen and we can dismiss them. Why? By confining it, you are already making a prejudicial assumption that the causal factors behind the phenomenon should all fit in the laboratory. But we don't know the mechanisms of the phenomenon. So how can we make that assumption? It's an arbitrary assumption. So what was the name of this Italian guy again? Becci?
Marcello Bacci.
Marcello Bacci. You cannot take Bacci out of the equation until you know the mechanisms of the phenomenon well enough to know how far you can go in excluding things, in isolating the experiment. For as long as you have not even a faint idea of what the mechanisms entailed are, you cannot exclude anything. You cannot exclude the place. You cannot exclude Bacci. You cannot exclude anything. You cannot put it inside the laboratory and expect the same result to happen. And when it doesn't happen, you say, therefore, this is nonsense. It doesn't happen. Well, the conditions are obviously different. A lot of this stuff will only be constellated or triggered, causally instigated by a set of states that may go over large distances. Now, goodness knows, we know in physics this is the case. You know, quantum entanglement happens over arbitrary distances. And this malaria genome mutation rate clearly is something that entails a much larger distance than the confines of a laboratory. Large enough that it samples whether malaria is happening frequently enough within it or not. That's not a laboratory. No, that's a country probably, or a region of the world. So if you ask me whether any attempt to debunk psi effects based on extremely restrictive laboratory conditions defined without awareness of the potential mechanisms underlying the phenomenon, whether those attempts to debunk are reliable, I would tell you, no, they're not reliable at all. I think for psi, we have to be humble enough to understand that right now, and that was Jung's approach, that was Jung's clinical approach. For psi, we have to be humble enough to say, we are not at the stage where we are in quantum field theory, in which we understand the mechanisms enough that we know how to isolate something without sort of handicapping the experiment. We are at the stage of astronomy. We are at the stage of observational science, not at the point where we understand enough about the mechanisms that we can say, okay, now let's bring it under the confines of the laboratory because now we know what we are doing. No, we don't know what we are doing. It's silly to try to confine it right now. It's observational science. It's astronomy. Jung did exactly that. That's how Jung went about it, observational science.
You may find it interesting too. The woman who mentored me into that type of voice phenomena research, Dr. Annabelle Cardoso, she sat and worked with Marcello Bacci for several years. She knew him, his wife. The method itself was derived from, you're familiar with EVP, or electronic voice phenomena.
I heard
Before
of
that
it.
was
I know what it is. Yes.
before that was the name or the moniker that it went under. They used to be called Radove voices. There was a gentleman named Konstantin Radove who pioneered the vocal phenomenon work. Radove, for I think a decent period of time, was a student of one Carl Jung.
There you go. It's not only astronomy. Zoology, a lot of zoology is done observationally. Zoologists go to the field and study animals in their natural habitat. We know that if you take a colony of meerkats and we put it in a sterile laboratory, you're not going to learn anything about the natural behavior of meerkats because there are a great number of things they would not do under those confines. So we know it's silly to try to do zoology or anthropology in a non-observational way. We know it's silly to isolate the phenomenon from the natural environment in which it happens. But for psi, we 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 are not aware enough to understand that it may be as silly to try to trigger strong psi in the lab as it is silly to understand the natural behavior of meerkats by putting them on an operating table. And it's a pity because it's so obvious, methodologically speaking, it's so obvious that it's a methodological error to confine things before you know what's going on. And even sometimes when you know what's going on, then you know you can't confine them. It's like trying to do anthropology by putting subjects in a room. Good luck with that. Go kidnap 5 uncontacted Amazonian tribesmen, put them in the confines of 4 walls, and try to understand their tribe's behavior. I mean, we know it's silly to do that, but when it comes to psi, we don't know we should do that, right? If it doesn't happen in lab, then it doesn't happen. Then it's nonsense. Oh man, where
That
we
was
are in
the
the
first.
world.
That was the first and best kidnapping metaphor I've ever heard. Thank you for your time and this, Mimir. Thank you for the opportunity to ask it. I know I don't get to speak with you every week, Bernardo, but every week through the questions people ask here, which are incredibly insightful, every week you speak to me, and you've changed how we do our research and our work. So I can't thank you and everybody here enough. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing this with me. Amir, maybe the last question would be a nice excerpt to put publicly.
Sure. Yeah.
I'm not ashamed at all to say this in public. I probably would have written about it at some point. So to make it available, so these guys can refer to it and say, well, have you thought about that? Maybe it's useful.
Great. Yeah, definitely. Definitely if it helps you, Ron, and no, with pleasure. Um,
Sure.
great.
Yeah, and this all helped me. Again, thank you both. This is tremendous.